Hi, welcome to the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, a lecture on how the Soviet Jew was made by Dr. Sasha Senderovich. Thank you so much for coming together this evening. We first, of course, want to remember Ariel Anderson, Brian Fraser, Alexandria Werner, and think about the 5 students who are we're praying and hoping will recuperate quickly in the hospital. So maybe we'll take a few moments of silence to think about them. Yeah. We're thinking about all their families and friends, and also thinking of all the faculty and staff and students who are on campus and really struggling on February 13th. And I know we're all coming out of that and trying to heal as a community. And I know many people didn't feel up for coming this evening, which is completely understandable. And others really wanted to continue, and that's their way of coping as well. So it's great to see students and community members and faculty here with us in person, and we know that others are live streaming from their homes, and others will probably watch the recording at another point. So it's been a very difficult time since February 13th, and it's really is also nice to come together as a community and do what we do, which is discuss kind of important issues related to Jewish studies. And so thank you very much for being with us. So I at first wanted to thank our many co-sponsors for the talk this evening, which include the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, International Studies Program, the Office for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the Department of Linguistics, Languages and Cultures, the Center for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies, and the Department of History. And I really want to thank our colleague who's been active in Jewish Studies program for many, many years and is a professor of history in the history department, the historian of Russian and Eastern Europe, Dr. Matt Polly, who initiated and organized this great event this evening. His first book, Breaking the Tongue, Language, Education, and Power in Soviet Union from 1923 to 34, concerns the political acculturation of the first generation of Soviet Ukrainian citizens through native language schooling and pedagogical innovation in the 1920s and early 1930s, and references issues of Yiddish language instruction and Jewish identity in early Soviet Ukraine. And his next book-length project is entitled Raising Nobody's Children, Juvenile Poverty, Crime, and Salvation in the City of Odessa, 1880 to 1940, and addresses, among other subjects of concern, children's welfare societies for poor Jewish children and assistance to juvenile victims of the 1905 Odessa pogrom. So Dr. Matt Polly will be introducing our honored speaker for this evening. We also, I think many of you picked up, we have complimentary books as you walk in, but if you didn't take one, you're most welcome to take one on your way out. So, Dr. Matt Polly, thank you.
Well, we made it. I didn't know we'd get here, so I want to join Yael in acknowledging the trauma that has been inflicted on our community, and express my hope that maybe this event is some way forward for at least those of us who are gathered here to re-engage scholarship and to begin talking to one another about really critical research concerns related to Jewish studies. So I'd like to get the formalities out of the way and list Dr. Senderovich's tremendous achievements, and this is just a short abbreviated list, I assure you, before offering some personal commentary. So Dr. Senderovich is an assistant professor, soon to be associate professor in Slavic languages and literature at the in Slavic Languages and Literature and the Jackson School of International Studies, and a faculty affiliate of the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Together with Harriet Morav, he translated from Yiddish David Bergelson's novel Judgment, and also together with Professor Morav, he is currently working on a book, In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, a collection of stories by several different authors translated from both Yiddish and Russian. He's also published on contemporary Soviet-born immigrant Jewish authors in America. His first monograph, How the Soviet Jew Was Made, which is the subject of our concern tonight, was published by Harvard University Press in 2022. In addition to his scholarly work, he's also published essays on literary, cultural, and political topics in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the New York Times, The Forward, Lilith, Jewish Currents, The Stranger, and The New Republic. So, and again, this is an abbreviated list, I assure you. I want to remark on the fact that nearly 1 year ago, Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine at 3:40 a.m. Kyiv time on February 24th, which was approximately 8:30 p.m. East Lansing time on February 23rd. So we're coming up in a little less than an hour and a half on the 1 year anniversary. When we were thinking of who to invite for our annual public lecture and teaching session on Yiddish culture and language, I began to ponder who has recently written on the history of the vibrant Yiddish culture that existed in Ukraine, and immediately thought of Professor Senderovich. Professor Senderovich will candidly tell you he is not one who considers himself to be an expert on Ukraine. And yet, he, like many American and former Soviet Jews, traces his heritage to Ukraine and the former Pale of Settlement. Much of his fantastic book, How the Soviet Jew Was Made, concerns the multi-ethnic space of contemporary Ukraine, specifically Volhynia and Odessa, during the revolutionary years and early Soviet period. He told us at dinner last night that the war has forced him to reconsider his relationship between his scholarship and a Ukrainian-specific context. And upon reflection, he discovered that much of what he was already teaching about Soviet Jewry had a great deal to do with Ukraine. Sasha has done what he can to continue to highlight the violence and suffering in Ukraine, including organizing an excellent series of Zoom talks by distinguished scholars from Ukraine who presented via Zoom at his home institution, the University of Washington. He's also donated honoraria to Ukrainian aid organizations, as well as a signed copy of his book to an auction run by the nonprofit Tamizdat Project to raise funds for students displaced by war in Ukraine. In the copy that he offered up for auction, he wrote in the following inscription, quote, "I wish the violence in Ukraine in the 1920s, about which I wrote extensively in this book, was merely history without awful contemporary echoes 100 years later in the 2020s, end quote. Professor Senderovich would be quick to remind you that he's not a historian, and yet through the prism of literature, we're invited into the complex, fraught, but also celebratory world of Jewish life in the early Soviet Union. And it is not a story that can be easily reduced. Sasha has added immeasurably to our understanding of this more distant past, but also to the recent past and the subjectivities of the present. As the renowned writer Gary Steingart, whose family also emigrated from the USSR, wrote in a superlative review of How the Soviet Jew Was Made, Professor Senderovich's insights help explain both the Jewish and Soviet jokes that came out of the same mouths as I was growing up, and were likely created by the same people. They contextualize both my father's aching for the void that might once have been filled with Jewish practice and his new Soviet man machismo. In other words, true to his title, Sasha's book tells us much about the outlook, longing, and aspirations of former Soviet Jews who have come to the United States and are an intimate part of our social fabric. We're in for a treat tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sasha Senderovich.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Matt. I mean, this was a very generous introduction, going in places I hadn't suspected that one might go in, including the inscription for a for a book for an auction. Well, they've also posted these things. Anyway, there is an auction happening. I guess we should give a shout out to the Thomas Dad Project that's running an auction of all kinds of books. Various first editions, lots of scholarly books to raise funds for students who ended up being caught up in the war and ended up coming to study in the U.S. So those of you here, those of you watching on live stream, look them up as well. And thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you also to Yael Aronoff for the initial introduction, and to Michigan State University for inviting me here, and especially I understand the difficult moment that it is now for you in this community to continue with this program, but also everything else that you do. So I'm very honored to be here, especially at this time. And like Matt, I'm cognizant of the fact that at some point during this talk we'll hit exactly 1 year since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is also was somewhat earlier on the West Coast, which means that I stayed up. Well, I don't know, probably everybody who was following stayed up the whole night, but the night of staying up began early for me, and kind of didn't end in many ways. Let me, also, I'm very honored that some of you here also read parts of the book and gathered to talk about the book, which is just an unbelievable honor for somebody who's written a first book. Some of you know some of the things that I'll talk about, but many of you don't. There are also some students here, which is really always wonderful to see. I don't know who is watching this on YouTube, so I might say some things to those of you who've already read it that may be repetitive. But for those of you who have read it and might find things repetitive, I do have something that is not in the book. So there will be a brief interlude of material that is not published. And I'll kind of tell you what I'm going to do, and then I'll do it, and then we'll hopefully have Q&A. I'll set things up a little bit for you. I want to read about a page from the book to kind of. It's a published work, and we academic writers work on our writing sometimes. So I wanted to give you a sense of kind of how I write, and then I want to talk about what the book does, what the book aspires to do, and then I'll take a little break for a kind of interlude for a family story that is not in the book that connects Ukraine, the middle of Russia, and Michigan. There'll be a local tie-in, and then I'll give you one example of how I do what I do in the book, and that'll be not about Ukraine. And in part, I chose the particular thing to focus on based on what I taught earlier in Dr. Pauli's class, because there's some students here from that class, and I sort of promised them to kind of further embellish, add on to what we've talked about earlier in the morning. So. When one writes a book about the Soviet period, about the Soviet 1920s and 1930s, it seems that one has a default choice of colors for the title page, for the cover, and those are always red and black. And it was actually very funny when I got back to my hotel room. I don't have a TV at home. I have a TV, but I don't watch, I don't have cable. So when I got back, MSNBC was on, Julia Yalfi was on, talking about Ukraine. There were shelves of book behind her, and there were these kinds of books, including these titles. So when you publish a book on the 20s and 30s, it seems like the red and the black is what they steer you into, and there are countless examples. So my press first wanted to kind of come up with this cover to make sure that people understand that this is talking about the Soviet period, to put the title in this banner that looks like the Soviet banner, and we sort of negotiated maybe we won't do that, that will go for a somewhat more subtle cover that doesn't quite do this over-the-head Soviet context. We had to compromise on colorizing the boy red, which gives it a little bit of a Schindler's List tinge, which is also not something that I'm particularly happy with. But I do want to talk about this image as a place to start. I mean, one doesn't judge the book by the cover, but why not? So I did not come up with this image, but I really love this image, and for what it sort of can tell us and how it can set up the story. I don't know very much. There was a very scant description of it in the archival sort of source that they found. But we know that these are hat makers from Skvira in Ukraine. There's, there are banners behind them. One of them is in Ukrainian and the other one is in Yiddish. And they're partially obscured, so we can't fully tell what they are, but it appears that they are part of some relief effort of collecting funds. This is probably 1922 or so, so possibly collecting funds for survivors of pogroms in Ukraine, kind of during the Russian Civil War. They pose with their tools of trade, various things that you need to make hats and different parts of hats. And the other slogan behind them is in Yiddish, and I can also only make it out partially, but I can see Ratenmacht, Soviet power. Some Bolshevik slogan. There's a subtle portrait of Lenin above them. Very subtle. I like that it's subtle. It's not like the red flag kind of sort of beating it over one's head. But I sort of appreciate what this cover is kind of making us think about. And also what it problematizes, right? So how the Soviet Jew was made, everybody here is a man, boy, male. And in various parts in the book, and I kind of write about this explicitly, when I try to think about the figure of the Soviet Jew for various reasons, have to think about gender and have to think about how that figure that I'm dealing with in various texts that I'm working with is typed as male, and what that has to do with the kind of constellation of different histories. On the one hand, Jewish history, and then they have Soviet history. So on the kind of the side of Jewish history, the way in which Jews were discussed in European Enlightenment discourse, modernization discourses in the 18th century, the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when various empires and states were considering giving equal rights to Jews, the Jew was meant as a man, as male. So it often was connected to thinking about the army, the service in the army, in the way that sort of deals with that kind of figure of Jews as if it were only male. And on the other hand, in this early Soviet period, and the concern of the Bolshevik state with the making of the new Soviet man, that also kind of in a very clear way, through discussing kind of stereotyping kind of things with kind of a muscular person, worker in the factory, etc., how that figure also kind of is marked male. And people have written extensively about both of these issues. And so that is not to say that there were no Soviet Jewish women, of course, right? But when I think about the Soviet Jew, I have to think about what the texts from the time tell me and how they point me in the ways of thinking about how this figure is typed as male. And then kind of back to this cover, I mean, it's when I talked to a colleague about what they think my cover of my book should look like, and they said, you need a picture of a Soviet Jew making something. And here's somebody making hats, and we'll come back to the tailors later in the talk. But I also kind of appreciate that they're all of different ages. They have different head coverings, which can tell us various things about their possible religious observance. Possibly the older man with a beard is somewhat more traditional. I mean, I don't really know anything about them, but that's what they appear to be. If you pick up the book and you kind of turn it around, there's another boy on the back cover that didn't make it on the front of the cover, and I really like him as this kind of, earnest figure. So, kind of what do I mean by the figure of the Soviet Jew when I write this book. So I wanted to just read a page from the book instead of telling you what it is, to read you what I wrote and sort of try to edit in a way that would be satisfactory. And I'll bring to, just from the very beginning of the book, and summon to help the Russian language Soviet Jewish writer Isaac Babel. So in Isaac Babel's 1932 short story, The End of the Almshouse, set in Odessa during the period of violent unrest between 1918 and 1921 that came to be known as the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks expel a group of old Jews from a poorhouse located on the grounds of one of the city's Jewish cemeteries. The poorhouse was a charitable institution of the sort that had made Jews in the Russian Empire a self-functioning communal entity prior to 1917, when the Tsarist regime fell in February and Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in October. Now, with the dissolution of these communal structures, the elderly become displaced. The heat tormented the heap of rags that was dragging itself across the earth, the narrator of the story notes in the story's final lines. Their road lay along a joyless, scorched, and stony highway past wattle-and-up shanties, past fields choked with stones, past bombed-out houses, past the Plague Hill. Once upon a time in Odessa, this inexpressibly melancholy road had led from the town to the cemetery. Jolted out of place by the upheaval of the revolution and no longer able to live out their days in peace, the elderly Jews find themselves on the road. This road, stretching past buildings recently ravaged by violence and alongside the century-old burial mound that contains the bodies of victims of much earlier disasters, Odessa's various plague epidemics, is said to have, quote, once upon a time, or когда-то in Russian, linked the city with the cemetery, indicating 1920-1929 as the time span of composition at the bottom of the text. Isaac Babel published the story in 1932, more than a decade after the events described in it. In the story, the road appears suspended in time and place, as though no longer leading where it once did. Moreover, their road, he writes, doroga ich in Russian, or given another meaning of the noun in Russian, the journey of theirs, is not just a physical space, which the writer refers to as a highway or chassé in the same sentence, but also the displaced Jews' trajectory to destinations unknown. As the story's language turns the group of older Jews into a heap of rags, gruda lachmotiev in Russian, the people begin to resemble their disintegrating clothes, reminders of a faraway past that managed to persist. So what happened to Isaac Babel's heap of rags, last seen moving along a road and suspended out of time? Perplexed by the open-ended conclusion of the story, I began to follow the remnants of a once-rooted culture scattered across the landscape of Bolshevik Russia and, after its formation in 1922, the Soviet Union in the first 2 decades after the revolution. I traced the proverbial heap of rags, defined by its many idiosyncrasies, as it was dispersed from its origin points in Ashkenazi Jewish communities in the Russian Empire's western borderlands and through the subsequent encounters with the USSR's stated ideological and cultural program, building the world's first multi-ethnic society united by the common aim of equality under communism. I came to understand the heap of rags not as a pejorative term, but as a shorthand for the collection of habits, practices, and cultural tropes associated with the defunct empire's Ashkenazi Jews that were appended by the revolution but did not remain behind and die off in the old world. Instead, personal characteristics, worn-out possessions, disaggregated bits of culture, and uprooted customs carried on across the landscape of the Soviet experience. Along the way, these bits of culture encountered and were modified by new ideological messages and structural pressures. The Soviet Jew, the layered, indeterminate, and fluid figure that emerged from this alchemy, remained in perpetual motion. So this book tries to outline this figure's contours. And so the way that I do it is by kind of trying to really trace the outlines, right? It's not I can't claim that this is the full picture, but I try to draw a little bit in one corner, a little bit in the other corner, and a little bit somewhere else, so that something like an outline begins to emerge. So I wanted to talk about kind of different ways in which I do it, first of which is thinking about the map of this particular story. So this is a map in the book that I worked with a map maker to make, and the difficulty here, and the map maker I think did it very well, is to put a time on the map of a space, which is kind of difficult to represent in a two-dimensional map. So what you see in the kind of darker gray, both on the inset and also in the big map, is the outlines of the Pale of Jewish settlement, where Jews had been restricted to live by rights of residence in the Russian Empire from the partitions of Poland in the 18th century until the February Revolution of 1917. So this space, this legal entity stopped existing in February of 1917. Jews could move and live elsewhere. But I've asked the map maker to overlay this map of the past, as it were, onto the borders of the Soviet Union and post-World War I Europe, so Soviet Union after 1922, so that you can see the new borders that cut through the space that had been a kind of contiguous cultural space, right? So that we can think about how, Ashkenazi Jews who had lived in something like, not exactly a unitary space, but much more of a unitary space than what it became in the aftermath of World War I and also the Revolution, how that map became divided. And the place names are all kind of rather idiosyncratic to the particular stories that I tell in the book. But on the big map, I trace various journeys, and I'll talk about them in a second. And this is just sort of a close-up of the part of the map that's in the borderlands, the western borderlands of the former Russian Empire, corresponding to the Pale of Settlement. With apologies to Ukrainianists for the choice of, but also Belarusianists, right, for the choice of the defaulting to Russian for spelling of place names. That was, a decision made not lightly in consideration of the people. Kind of the choice was that you defaulted to the state language of the space, and this map would have had too many languages in a short amount of space if it was defaulting to Belarusian and Ukrainian and Polish and etc. So I understand the problems with making that choice, but the book explains that, at least in some way. So kind of looking at the map, I wanted to talk about a couple of approaches that the book outlines in how I try to map out this figure of the Soviet Jew, one of which is a time frame. So, I begin in 1917 and I end in the late 1930s for a couple of reasons. One has to do with this map, that we can think about the beginning of the period and of the figure that I trace as the end of the Russian Empire and the end of the Pale of Settlement that kind of reconfigures this map. On the one end, so 1917, and then the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939 that returns to the same exact geography one more time and redraws those boundaries again, right? So, so that map changes yet again, so I'm trying to kind of think about the time markers, as it were, as kind of the violence of the immediate post-revolutionary period on one end and leading into the violence of the Holocaust on the other end. Another reason that so it's only about 20 years or so, I'm a close reader of texts. The book is not about that many texts, actually. And I have trouble writing these kind of very comprehensive things, and I like to go in depth, and that was the 20 years is sort of a good amount of time. But there's also kind of strange, almost incidental reason that became also important for me. That is, that has to do with the way that the term Soviet Jew tends to be understood in the United States, right? So people of a certain generation, when they hear the term Soviet Jew, come at it from a kind of Cold War perspective. Often sort of somewhat older, US-born Jews who had participated in the movement to free Soviet Jews in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, so the Soviet Jewry movement, a much later period, sort of working on behalf of these people to emigrate from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Jew is understood in this kind of much later vintage with reference to a later Soviet era history, often kind of crystallizing around the idea that Soviet Jews are especially persecuted in the Soviet Union because of their nationality or ethnicity. And people, when they think about that, they think about the Soviet passport. They think about the Soviet passport. It's almost a commonplace to think of a Soviet passport that indicates people's ethnic belonging, and the Jews are somehow especially marked. So what's interesting to me is that that line in the passport is not there in the period that I write about. The nationality line or ethnicity line doesn't really get introduced until the 1930s. The passport's introduction has nothing to do with Jews. It has to do with peasants who are being tethered to collective farms and not allowed to leave those collective farms. So it has to do really with the politics of collectivization in Ukraine. And then the nationality line gets introduced, really it's there before, but it starts really being emphasized in 1938 when the Soviet state starts to worry about Poles and ethnic Germans in these Western borderlands because of the kind of worries about the attacks on the Soviet Union from Poland. The Soviet Union is worried about that in the 1930s. So that line has nothing to do with Jews, even though culturally, in the West, the association is between Soviet Jews in the passport. So I wanted to think about the earlier period when that legal definition isn't there, right? That sort of is a much more open-ended way to think about what the Soviet Jew might be when we're not referencing specific line in somebody's passport. So that was sort of really important for me. So that's a time frame. Another issue that's really important for me in this book is thinking about language and languages. Approximately half of the material in this book was originally produced in Yiddish, the language of the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews in the Russian Empire on the eve of 1917, but also in the early years of the Soviet period, but also later too. And approximately another half was produced in Russian. And throughout the book, I think about the relationship between these two languages as kind of almost always already Russian and Yiddish at the same time, or Yiddish and Russian. So when I write about Yiddish material, there are echoes of the sort of Soviet Russian language context, and Russian here is the state language. And when I write about Russian language material, there are always echoes of the Yiddish. So I try to kind of think across that linguistic boundary, and I'm not the first to do it. There are other wonderful scholars who've done that. Harriet Murav, who was mentioned before, Amelia Glazer, Gabriela Safran, Misha Krutikov, among others. But for me, kind of one additional thing that becomes important is translation too, when it comes to language. To both the practice of translation, but also translation as a conceptual approach. So as Matt mentioned in his introduction, I worked on translation. I worked on translation when procrastinating and not writing this book, which was many years. I edited one translation of a Yiddish novel, and I co-translated another, and those texts became primary texts for this study. When one translates or when one edits a translation, you develop a very kind of intimate relationship with the text, and you begin to see things in the text that are maybe harder to come by when you don't stare at it for that long and for that many times. I came to think about the sort of the need to really think bilingually, at least in the case of this material, to think about how translation itself shapes the way that we think about this, and I write about this in different parts of the book. And also what's important to me is to make it possible for the reader to, if they want, access those primary texts on their own. Which isn't always a case when you write about foreign literatures in American academia, right? You often are the only subject expert, and people have to trust you and your interpretation. With this book, I came to this book last after these other translation projects so that people can actually maybe disagree with me after they can consult these texts in translation on their own. So if you pick up a book, know that there is now text that you can read that you couldn't read 10 years ago, that are available. More of them are available to the English reader. So, and then one last thing that I'll say, kind of very conceptually, very broadly, is one thing that this book doesn't do. So I'm in literary studies and cultural studies and film studies, and I write a book where I try to think specifically about the Soviet Jew as a figure, as opposed to doing what some other people have done, which is writing about something we might call Russian Jewish literature or Jewish Russian literature. And I very deliberately don't do that, in part because various studies of Russian Jewish literature tend to focus on the Russian part of Russian Jewish, as linguistically Russian, as literature by people who are ethnic Jews, who have written on, let's say, Jewish themes or Jewish topics in the Russian language, often with an emphasis of trying to lay some claim to the greatness of Russian literature, as it were, right? I'm sort of using air quotes here, with something to prove, right? So, and this literature is very interesting, it's very important. I'm not sure I have anything else to add to the subject, so I don't try to think about, poets like, Osip Mandelstam, Pasternak, kind of lots of other names, trying to think about how Jews contributed to the project of Russian literature. And instead, I really try to think about the Soviet Jew as a figure where both the Jew and Soviet have equal weight. So that's another sort of kind of thing that I try to problematize, is that often when one thinks about Jews in the Soviet Union or Jews in the Russian Empire, especially Jews in the Soviet Union, the understanding, especially in the West, is that the Soviet Union had destroyed the Jew, and that the Soviet Jew is a Soviet who is not a Jew anymore, and you need to somehow recover the Jew out of the sort of debris of the Sovietness, right? So as it were, to emphasize how the Jewishness somehow persevered despite. So I'm trying to do something different, right? I'm trying to think about the Soviet Jew who is both a Jew and a Soviet, a figure that exists in a productive tension between languages scattered across this geographic and cultural landscape. And I'm not trying to disentangle the two. And in my book, I'm really trying to understand how the two make one, how the Soviet Jew comes to be as a figure. So kind of let me give you kind of a quick sense of the different questions that I ask, and I'll kind of raise them as a sort of a central question about various chapters of the book, and then I'll give you that promised biographical story, and then one example. So I try to, I'm a close reader of texts. I really appreciate what Matt had to say in the introduction, but also to me yesterday, to what how a historian might read my book, and that's very meaningful. My partner is an historian, so that kind of question has always been in my ear. To me, as somebody who was learning to write about literature, what is the point of your writing about literary texts, right? So kind of this learning to explain it to somebody who might have a more historically minded imagination sort of taught me to be a different kind of writer. So what I try to do in the book is I try to dive into a kind of a central text in every chapter, or sometimes the central constellation of a couple of texts. And I kind of go deeply into them, and I bring in various other contextual materials, journalistic accounts, various historical accounts, to try to kind of make that into kind of a richer cultural historical environment, to answer a couple of central questions that help me map out what the Soviet Jew might be. So, what happens, for example, when Jews end up assaulted by multiple warring armies in the midst of post-revolution violence. And I try to think in this book about the Soviet Jew as kind of one of the pillars, as it were, one of the foundations of this figure as trauma of pogroms of the period that immediately followed the revolution, 1918 to 1921 roughly, events that unfolded mostly in Ukraine, where tens of thousands of Jews perished in violence that was perpetrated by multiple sides. And my guide to this question is this very weird novel by a very known by then Yiddish author, David Bergelson, who by then was already an established sort of classic, really, of Yiddish literature, who writes this book in the mid-1920s in Berlin called Midas Hadin, or Judgment, that's published throughout the late 1920s, where he tries to think from afar about the borderlands of Poland, the newly independent Poland, and Ukraine that is kind of tentatively, tenuously held by Bolsheviks. And in that novel, his protagonist is a border guard who is not Jewish. So it's also a very kind of interesting text to read, to think about how he tries to represent a non-Jew who speaks Yiddish, because that's the language of the novel, who is a border guard and a Chekist. So he is a member of the Chika, the Bolshevik border guard secret police. And he is there to sort of emphasize Bolshevik order. And this text had been read by others, especially during the Cold War, as a kind of, praise to the Bolshevik regime, and therefore dismissed by, a generation of earlier critics, and sort of deliberately not translated into English because it was thought to be a kind of a text that was, was not important to bother with, too propagandistic. But when I translated it together with Harriet Murad, we started to be kind of weirded out by the fact that the supposed Bolshevik hero is presented as a Gothic monster with wounds on his neck. He's really dying throughout the novel. He doesn't strike you as somebody who is able to kind of hold on to Bolshevik power that is supposed to somehow promote the Soviet state. And I became, when I started writing this book, really thinking about David Bergelson, who lives in Berlin at this time. He's a refugee from pogroms. He lives in Berlin, which is full of refugees from not just Jewish, lots of different kind of people who moved from these borderlands that were scarred by war. And he lives amid people who begin to collect their testimony about surviving pogroms. And he writes a novel about a time when the end of that experience isn't yet known. So it's set in the middle of the Russian Civil War, not in the aftermath, and he's trying to enter the mind of Jews in this little shtetl on the border who don't know which power is going to be there for long. And so this novel is kind of rife with anxiety about what might unfold, in the kind of haunting about the return of violence that appears to have ended, but maybe has not. And I try to think, so what you see here, this came out as a book. Those of you who know Yiddish can appreciate what it is that I'm showing, that there were two editions published nearly simultaneously. One was published in Vilna, which was then Poland, or Vilno, and another was published in Kiev, which was then Soviet Union. So it's the same title, but if you look at, even if you don't know Hebrew or Yiddish, you can see that the letters look differently. So the title is spelled according to Soviet orthography in the Kiev edition, and according to the Yivo orthography in the other one, which has to do with how Hebrew is spelled. But when I think about this, I try to contextualize a novel like this, but also all the other texts that I write about in the broader cultural context. And in the case of this Yiddish novel about the Cheka, about the Bolshevik secret police, Bergelson is writing it by the time when there's already a genre of novels in Russian that glorifies the Cheka, but that some have read, a scholar called Miriam Maguire read them as Cheka Gothic, that they're sort of texts about the Bolshevik secret police, but they're written in this kind of Gothic mode. So there are many of them by the time he writes it, and he was also writing this book at the time when there's a whole genre of books about the Civil War that is kind of glorifying the Civil War. So I'm trying to think about a Yiddish text that's also really speaking to these Soviet texts and how it's important to read literature in the Jewish language within this broader context that is known to the author. So that's the kind of the first question. My second question, and this is students who were in the class this morning, we talked about this text, and I'll talk more about it at the end of the talk, but I try to think about Soviet modernization is another sort of pressure point. So if pogroms is the first one, the Soviet modernization through industrialization, collectivization, introduction of various sort of attributes of industrial modernity, electricity, radio, cinema, how they begin to reshape people who live in the former Pale of Settlement and kind of are faced both with the ideological project, but also with the project that is sort of very day-to-day reshapes their lives. So what happens, and that I do this in chapter 2, when a traditional multi-generational family exists in a space on the outskirts of Minsk, and when they board a brand new trolley that tethers their home to the expanding Soviet city, and when they go see a movie. So I sort of deal with this fictional family that goes to see a movie, and I'll talk a little bit more about later what it is that they see, how they get there, how what they see shapes who they might be in the process of becoming. So sort of industrialization and modernization. Another question that I think about is what happens when an expedition is sent to Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous region. I can go back to the map here because many people might not be able to place it. It is so a place in the Soviet Far East on the border with Manchuria. What happens when an expedition is sent there to study the USSR's claims that the region is a hospitable new environment for Soviet Jews to call their official new home? And that was the case, right? When the Soviet Union established this place in the Far East called the Jewish Autonomous Region and proclaimed that this was going to be a place where Soviet Jews would resettle. But what happens, and that place still exists, by the way. If you look at a very detailed map of the Russian Federation, you will see the Jewish Autonomous Region, which still to this day on paper has an official language, Yiddish, right? I mean, nobody speaks it there, or very few people do, but it still exists. So what happens if, despite these ideological pronouncements, there is a pair of journalists assigned to this expedition that took place who in subsequent years go on to write literary sketches, a novel, a play, and even a book for children about Soviet Jews' arrival in this wonderful new promised land, but they can't seem to be able to describe those stories' main protagonist, the Soviet Jew, because it ends a figure being marked by its non-arrival. So I try to think about this very ideological constellation of the state proclaiming what Soviet Jews is supposed to be, and how people who are trying to describe it are unable to locate the prime sort of subject. So how the Soviet Jew in this case is a figure that doesn't arrive ideologically, geographically, where it is supposed to go. And these are just sort of some of the texts that I deal with. Another question for me is thinking about what happens when a one-time refugee from the Tsarist Empire returns to his native shtetl in what is by then Soviet Ukraine, who is now a refugee from not only the Pale of Settlement under the Tsars, but also from American capitalism, right? And how the texts see him as this doubly displaced person. And I try to write about a bunch of films set in the early 1930s that try to grapple with this kind of figure. So Jews who had left the Russian Empire before the revolution, and then some of whom returned during the Great Depression to the Soviet Union out of ideological aspirations, out of familial connections, for all kinds of reasons. What happens when one of such figures is described as, and I'm quoting, a socially crippled freak, социально искалеченный урод in Russian, according to a screenplay for one of these films, when such a person, thus conceived, is supposed to become an exponent of the new Soviet man. How do you turn this socially crippled freak into the new Soviet man, and how in the process you end up becoming a Soviet Jew who is not that? So I try to think about discourses about disability, discourses about freaks, which is quite, there's extensive literature to think about, and how the Soviet films are trying to map out this figure. This is from a film, The Return of Nathan Becker, this is the figure who is described as the socially crippled freak, who is here pictured building a wall of bricks, which is what you do in a Soviet film. He's competing with a man who never, who is not Jewish and who doesn't have that baggage, who builds a bit, better, more efficient wall. So kind of a fascinating film. That's a propaganda film that was made in the Soviet Union, but also played in America. There are reviews of it from New York, from the 1930s. And then kind of my last question that tries to kind of take this whole story full circle, tries to think about the figure of the trickster in Jewish literature, and I try to think about returning to the writer Isaac Babel, who is everybody's kind of paradigmatic case of the Soviet Jewish writer. But I try to think about Isaac Babel's obsession, and perhaps my own, with the figure of Herschel Astropolier, who is a trickster from Yiddish folklore, about whom Babel writes very early in 1918. And then he continues sort of dropping references to this figure who emerges out of Hasidic storytelling before the revolution, and he tries to bring that figure into sort of Soviet modernity in sort of covert ways. So this is I love this find. Stories of Herschel Astropolier are mainly oral folklore, but they were also printed and published. This is one of the many, many editions of this chapbook of short stories about Herschel Astropolier. Published, this is printed in Warsaw in 1895, but it's put out by a publisher who is based in Odessa, which is where Babel spent a big part of his childhood. And I try to imagine this book contains the story that Isaac Babel rewrites in Russian. And I do some work trying to really think that this might be the original, as it were, the implied original of the Russian text that exists in a different language. So I try to kind of answer different questions with the help of these different texts that map out the Soviet Jew. So I'll give you this kind of one family interlude that's not in the book, and I learned of it only in the last month and a half or so. And I'm still, so this is not going to be smoothly worked out because I'm still thinking about how this fits. But it's sort of kind of a family mystery, but it maps over some of the things that I raised for you as questions that I deal with. So I have relatives in Portland, Oregon. I live in Seattle, so it's close by, and these relatives are cousins some number of times removed. I always get confused in how these relationships work, of my mother. So the common ancestor is my mother's grandmother is the youngest sister of their grandfather. So their grandfather, anyway, I'll get to this in a second. I'm trying to think about how to set up the story. So the first mystery is this photo that I saw. I saw it before, but I really didn't think about it until about a month ago, on the back of which there was the year 1936, but nothing else, right? And so I know almost all of these people, and one of them I saw for the first time. So the woman on the very right of the photo is my great-grandmother, whose name is Mira, who was born in 1910 in Trestyanets in Ukraine. There's more than one Trestyanets. This is the one that's in the Vinnytsia region of Ukraine. And this is a picture where she is here with most of her siblings and their spouses, and her mother in the center, the older woman in the middle. And you can see the family resemblances of more or less of who is related to whom. And the man who is the mystery here is the man who is next to her, whose name at this point is Peter Zugman, spelled Peter, born Pesach Zugman, who emigrated to the United States before the First World War. So when I saw this photo and I realized that this is him, he is the younger brother of my Oregon relative's grandfather. This is too complicated, but he's not their grandfather, he is the younger brother of their grandfather. I mean, like, what is he doing in the photo in 1936? Because I know that everyone else never left the Russian Empire, and then what became the Soviet Union. So I encountered in my Portland cousins, there are 4 of them. Their youngest is in his late 60s. The oldest one is 81. They have all these pictures that they've had for years. And they kind of knew who the people were, but they couldn't read inscriptions on them because they don't know Russian. So they showed me this photo. And they said, can you translate what it says? And like, oh my God, this is insane. So what this is the wedding photo of their grandfather, my great-grandmother's oldest brother, whose name is Moishe. It became Misha. And this is his wedding photo taken in 1912 in Kakhovka, near Kherson. Right? So these would be names recognizable from the news of the last year. A very posed photo, a kind of a proper wedding photo. So this is, November 1912. So he and his wife shortly afterwards left for Saskatchewan, right? And anyway, there's more to say about that, but I won't at the moment. So they go in 1912, and then my relatives show me this, and my jaw drops again, because this is a photo of 2 of the siblings from this photo that's taken 18 years later, but this is them younger, 2 of the sisters. So there are 8 siblings altogether, right? So this is 2 of the sisters who took this photo in 1918 and inscribed on the back of it in Russian, which also tells me something about the languages that they knew and spoke, which is also very interesting. Each of them inscribed, one was named Leia, the other one was named Bluma, and they write it to these 2 people who are now married and living in North America, right? So somehow this postcard gets to North America and is now in the family archive of my parents. And the thing that really shocks me here is that this is 1918, Ufa. Right, so where is Ufa? This is a Google map from just a couple of days ago. You can't take any organized public transport right now, right, because there's a war. So this is a walking map from Trestenets in Ukraine, where these relatives were from, where they were all born, in Ufa, right, all the way in the Ural Mountains. It's still Europe, but it's the very edge of the continent, kind of almost Asia. And that they were there in 1918 is really a surprising story because, it's hard to imagine how they would be there before. So the story that is commonly sort of known is that they maybe had gone away from pogroms in Ukraine, but the pogrom in their town was later. There's a kind of famous pogrom in Trestenets. This is an image from their hometown that's, was a whole year later, but they're already in Ufa earlier. So that's a mystery that I don't know, but somehow they ended up in a different geography. And then there's another picture that's, where my jaw drops yet again, taken around 1922 or so, already in Ufa, a picture of their parents. Of all of these siblings' parents. So this is my great-grandmother's mother and father. This photo is really strange. I don't know what's going on in this photo, right? What is happening with it's a studio photo, right? Their church, onion domes you see, that's painted very clearly. But what the relatives in Portland told me is that you have to look at the sack in the foreground, right? The main protagonist of the photo is the sack in the foreground, which according to their lore is a parcel that their grandfather, so these people's oldest son, sent to them from America. He by then was already in Oregon. So he sent them this parcel. They took it to the photo studio, right, to take as evidence, right, that the package arrived. And then this photo is hanging in the apartment of one of my cousins in Portland in 2023, right? So this really strange way in which, so the way that I think about this, so these people never left Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. They became Soviet Jews looking at you plaintively from an old photo, right, on the wall of people who have descendants who are really American Jews. But there's a disconnect between what is known and what isn't known. So in some ways, I'm trying to think about, I didn't think that there was a motivation like this for writing this book, but maybe there is, right? That there's something about that story that many people actually can relate to, many people who are descended from Jews from the Russian Empire who live in the United States, but those connections are sort of lost over time. So I promised a local tie-in. Right, so back to this photo that I started with, this mystery. What is the younger brother of my Portland relatives' cousins doing in this photo in 1936, when I know that he already by then had been in North America and by then in the United States for more than 2 decades. So 1936, right, is what the photo says. And I have a guess when I see it, and then I have, for the first time in my life, an occasion to ask someone to help me with Ancestry.com, which I'd never had to do because I didn't think I had American relatives, right? So somebody helps me, Noam Siena, the mentioned, thank you Noam if you're watching, who's done this before, and he within an hour finds me what I suspected to be the case. So it turns out that there's a ship manifest arriving in Plymouth, England. This was sailing from New York, where you would transfer, I don't know how you proceed from there to the Soviet Union, but there are a number of people disembarking, and I'm interested in the man who is, if you see Zugman, this is number 54, third from the bottom, right? So Peter Zugman, he used to be Pesach Zugman, who names his destination as Ufa, Revolutionная Street, Revolution Street, which is a street in Ufa where my mother grew up, born in 1955, right? So I'm like, okay, this is fascinating. He's going to visit his family, and then I look at the date of the ship manifest, May 16th, 1936, and then it clicks, right? This is his father, who died on May 14th, 1936. And is buried in Ufa, left the, Trosteniets before there was the violence of the pogroms, before there would have been Holocaust, right? Kind of safely dies, of old age, far away in the middle of Russia, 2 days before his son. So it seems like maybe he received the telegram, right, that your father is close to death and come get on the ship and come. And then there is a ship manifest of him re-entering the United States at Ellis Island on July 1st, 1936, so I can sort of speculate that he was there for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And here's the local connection that I promised. Right, he lists that he was naturalized as a citizen in Detroit in 1927, and his address is in Detroit, Michigan, in 1936. So this kind of fascinating, for me, this is theoretical. There's a chapter in my book about Jews, American Jews returning to the Soviet Union, trying on becoming Soviet Jews. But here there is also a family connection that probably, if I have it, right, there probably in many families of this background, such connections also exist. So let me talk for just another 5-7 minutes, and then we'll take Q&As. Back to my book, I wanted to give one example of how I go about sort of asking questions in the book that I mapped out. So I'm a literary scholar. I think my archive, as it were, is literary texts and films. And I'll give you an example of one particular question that was particularly fascinating to me. So this is, I think, with the novel that I talked about to some of Professor Pauly's students this morning. This is a novel by Moshe Kurbak, a Soviet Yiddish writer who made his career in Vilno in Poland, and then moved to Minsk in 1926, so moved to the Soviet Union. And he wrote this novel called Zelmenyaner. The name comes from Zalman, the paterfamilias of the family. Zelmenyaner are his progeny. And it's a novel about this family, multi-generational family living in Minsk. So this is a novel that is serialized over the course of 6 years, between 1929 and 1935. And when I deal with serialized literature, and various other texts that I work with are also serialized, serialized literature can be read and should be read in its context, not only as a book between two covers, but something that existed organically on the pages of other kinds of publications and alongside other publications. So this is the first chapter of this novel, is published in December 1929 in Stern, which is a monthly in Minsk. And why is there a giant portrait of Stalin facing the table of contents? Because this was the 50th birthday of Stalin. So there are congratulatory remarks to Stalin from the editorial board of Stern underneath the portrait. And the second item on the table of contents is Moishe Kulbak, right? The chapters, it says Kapiteln von einem Buch Die Mischpoche Zelminyaner. So there, it sort of begins to serialize this novel in 1929 in this very kind of specific ideological context. Moreover, he writes this novel at a time when Soviet Belarusia has 4 official languages in the interwar period. And this is the state seal of Soviet Belarusian Socialist Republic, or Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, sorry, with the proletariat of all the world unite, written in the 4 official languages, which are Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. Right, so Yiddish is one of the official languages, and that's really important because you realize that it's a state language. And when there's a state language, there's also state institutions that are operating in that language. And I'm starting to think about how these dots might connect. Okay, then I have a mystery. Like, I like working with mysteries. I still haven't solved fully the family mystery, but there's a mystery in this novel in that, and this I promised to the students in the morning, the family in this novel goes to see a movie. They go to see a movie. We don't have the title of the movie, but we have a description of what they saw. And it doesn't have to be a real film. It could just be something in the book, but I was interested. So this describes one of the older members of the older generation who wants to go back and see the movie again, but his wife doesn't want to. So he is content, has to be content, with reviewing in his mind all the ocean waters and white polar bears that had appeared before him that magical evening in the cinema. At night, stitching a pair of quilted pants, he thought with an aching heart about white bears and frozen travelers on icebergs, people for whom such pants would be just the thing. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I want to know, is this a real thing or not? And I have ideas about, and some of you who know film probably are beginning to speculate that you have maybe a title in mind, but I'm going to kind of play with this for a little longer. When I'm in Minsk, I try to read newspapers from the time. I know that this novel was beginning to be serialized in 1929. There's a reference to something that might be an actual film. Why don't I read the daily newspapers and look at the movie listings? Because there are only 2 movie theaters in Minsk in 1929, it's not that difficult. So I read the local newspaper called Rabochi, The Worker, and it has many things, including this announcement of a cow that had walked out of somebody's yard in September of 1929, and they're placed an ad to try to find it, which gives me a sense of what kind of a place Minsk is. Right, so capital of a Soviet Socialist Republic, but very much a place where you put an ad in the paper if your cow has gone out and not come back. Right, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the newspapers at the time are absolutely obsessed with writing about Soviet modernity, right? And they're particularly obsessed with writing about light rail, about the tramway, about the trolley. And there are weeks and weeks and weeks of build-up to the launch of the first trolley line. And it launches on October 14th, 1929. Right, so this ad is from September 1929, right? And then there's a tram also, right? So on the one hand, the cow, on the other hand, the tram. And there's this obsessive writing about the tram. And then when it launches, the guy who runs the newly launched, it's just one line in the beginning, he writes this, article on the first page of the newspaper about, singing praises to this new light rail, and about how, people who live on the outskirts of the city, a place where a cow might walk off and be lost, how people who live in these kinds of parts of town might benefit from getting on the tram and traveling into the city to see various cultural entertainment. And he particularly talks about cinema, theater, libraries, lectures, etc. Right? So this is a picture of a traffic policeman in Minsk in 1932 with the tram behind him. So I'll go back to this image that I showed earlier, this is a movie theater in Minsk in 1932. So a couple of years later, you can tell that it's 1932 from the giant 15 in Roman numerals that marks the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And there are tram tracks in front of this movie theater. In the novel, the family, the fictional family, hears the bell of the tram ring outside where they live, and that's when they know to get on it, and that's how they go see the movie. So to me, this is connected to the real events in Minsk in 1929. And so I go on with reading the newspaper chronicle, and of course, I find what I suspected would be the case, that 3 days after the after the tram launched, in one of the movie theaters in Minsk, they showed Nanook of the North. Right? So to those of you who don't know, this is a 1922 film by Robert Flaherty, who was an American ethnographer from Harvard, I believe, who made a film about the Inuit set in the Canadian Arctic. It's a problematic film about a lot of it was written by anthropologists and cultural historians. It was thought to be the first documentary ever made, which is not true. And in many ways, people who have come to write about this film thought about how the film is made by this, a white man from Harvard who comes to the native people beyond the Arctic Circle with his modern equipment, his giant cameras, and his particular kind of modern sensibilities, shaves off half of the igloo where this family lives to put his big camera in to observe them, so changing their way of life, right, as he is coming there to observe them, and is realizing that they no longer live in the way that he thought they had lived before, that they have already been changed by various aspects of modernity, including himself. So he makes them reenact on camera the things that they used to do before the arrival of quote-unquote modernity. So the way that they hunt, for example, and the way that it's depicted in the film is no longer corresponding to what they do in their real-life practices, but the film preserves as a documentary, as it were, something that had existed but doesn't exist anymore. So the term that the anthropologists use for this kind of work is salvage ethnography, right? And it's very problematic, right? Somebody who is coming from a vantage point of, kind of a modern Western society and is trying to impose a kind of primitive, right, reenactments on people who live their lives. So why am I talking about this, right? That kind of to wrap all this up, right? So this is the fictional family in Minsk that probably goes to see Nanook. Probably the writer saw Nanook. So what's interesting to me is that Moshe Kulbak, the author of the novel, has a day job. And his day job is he's a stylistic editor of the social science publications put out by the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, which, remember, Yiddish is an official language, has a Jewish studies department that operates in Yiddish. And what is that Jewish studies department put out in the Belarusian Academy of Sciences? It's interested in studying backward, I'm now using air quotes, right? Backwards Jews in the former Pale of Settlement, so as to understand how they could be Sovietized, right? So you need to understand their backward ways and customs so as to know how to change them through this, kind of modernizing Soviet project, right? So this is what he does by day. He is editing, stylistic editor of these publications, and by night he is writing a novel that is a parody of the ethnographic publications that he is tasked with. So the family that he writes about lives in a hoif. The Russian translation of this would be dvor, a courtyard. They all live in this enclosed space that resembles a shtetl as a kind of a basic unit of what Soviet Jewish social scientists are interested in studying at this time to understand how that particular place could be Sovietized. And he's writing about people who are encountering these sort of ideological pressures. But the novel that he is writing is reflecting not the Soviet Jew that the Soviet state intended to make, but instead a different kind of figure, right? Who has a different idiosyncratic sets of responses that is not one-to-one correlation to the way that that new figure of a Jew as a new Soviet man is imagined by the state, but instead becomes what I call, right, one of the instances of the Soviet Jew. I think with this, I finish, and hopefully we have time for questions. And those of you who are on live stream and you have questions, you can't ask them, but feel free to write me an email, which I put on the screen. I think you're supposed to use a microphone, if I'm not mistaken, for the live stream reasons.
Novels to try to understand the world as well, but there does seem to be a bit of nervousness about that. There was this controversy in France about a novel about Putin, and whether, you know, Macron should be reading a novel that could be propaganda, might not. As somebody who's read something that, you know, read a lot of work that might be propaganda or not, I wonder what your take is on that.
I mean, I don't know what you're referencing in particular, right? So I don't have an answer to that specifically, but I can sort of talk about how I read these kinds of texts that I sort of work with in the case of my book, right? So the things that I talked about today is, you know, really interesting, intricate, nuanced literature, but I also write about propaganda films, right? So there's a chapter here about propaganda films. Like, they could be dismissed as propaganda, but I'm interested. And I don't know, every time period is different, right? So I know how to deal with 1930s Soviet propaganda because I've read extensive literature about understanding the kind of aesthetics and the historical context of that kind of cultural production. For me to be interested in how something that could be dismissed as merely propagandistic could actually have really weird messages that do not seem to conform to what the propaganda is supposed to be doing. So, for example, you know, I'll just reference the things that I already referred to for the sake of clarity. This film about the Jew who had left the Russian Empire and returned to the Soviet Union, and returns to build, you know, the Soviet Union. The main conflict of the film is over how you lay bricks, which seems like the most boring, right, Soviet era production kind of sort of, you know, thing, which you would just sort of, your eyes would glaze over because it's so boring, right? Who can build a bigger wall in a short amount of time? But what's weird about this film is that this happens in the middle of a circus, right? This is what you're seeing. They're in the circus arena. What is going on, right? If this is a novel, a propagandistic novel about socialist production, and you're building a wall of a factory, why are you wasting labor for 8 hours, which is the length of a shift, building a brick wall in the middle of a circus, right? What does it make it, you know, are we still watching a propaganda movie? Or are we suddenly in some other aesthetic, you know, sort of situation where maybe it becomes a parody? And in that case, why is that something that's circulating widely and shown in New York as a propaganda picture to entice Jews who had left the Russian Empire 20 years before to return to the Soviet Union to build the socialist homeland? What is going on here? So I think, you know, it's a very indirect answer to your question, but kind of on working with literary texts and with films, I think it's very important to understand the period when they happen so that you can sort of understand how something that might be propaganda is made so that you can, you know, not appreciate it, but be able to kind of pull it apart and to see what it's doing that is maybe more than what it purports to be doing. So.
Thank you. So many questions. I mean, we've talked a lot over the past 2 days, so I find it amazing that I come up with more things to ask you. So that tells you something about the richness of what you're doing. I mean, in relationship to what you just addressed, I guess I'm interested in learning more about David Bergelson and the judgment, how it was received in Kyiv, because an edition was published there. in 1929, which strikes me as an important year when things are ramping up correctives against petty bourgeois Ukrainian nationalism, right? So, the judgment is a cautionary tale against nationalism, against the SRs maybe, but it's way more than that. As you point out in your analysis, it's not a pro-Bolshevik novel. In fact, it says quite critical things about the Bolshevik perception of Jews, or rather the Jewish perception of Bolshevik. So I guess I'm interested in simply learning more about the Ukrainian reception of the judgment. And then you don't talk about it, I think, in the book all that much, but Bergelson was an advocate for resettlement in Azerbaijan, right? So what's his evolution there? Are there works beyond what you described that actually talk about Jewish arrival, right? Your chapter is about Jewish non-arrival. Because the information is drawn from 1929 exploratory mission. I don't know. I forget how you call it, but there certainly could have been accounts of actual life in the 30s that might have been addressed.
Yeah,
so, thank you.
I'll try to how to answer this. As they say in Yiddish, auf einen Fuß, standing on one foot. Which actually is Talmudic and af regel oches, af regel echat, how to recite the complex answer very quickly. I don't know if I can sort of answer all of that. So the best authority on Bergelson, I love to talk about other people's books who actually grapple with these questions much more than I do. So the best book on Bergelson is Harriet Murav's 2019 book, where she really deals with the entirety of his oeuvre, and it's the only book to have done that. What's really kind of interesting about this particular figure, so this novel is available in English now in our translation. Please check it out. It's weird. It's very strange. It's a strange read that's worth people's time if you like weird literature. But there is a kind of the way that people conventionally approach this writer. So he is born in the 1880s. He lives until 1952, and he's executed in 1952 as one of the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which is a later story, right? My story here ends in the 1930s. The Anti-Fascist Committee is set up during the Second World War to basically kind of use Soviet Jews as an outreach to the West, right, to kind of support the Soviet, to raise funds for the Soviet war effort. And Bergelson is one of the kind of cultural figures who are involved with it. And they're all arrested in 1949, and all but one are executed, including Bergelson and 4 other writers, right? So they're sort of significant writers in Yiddish literature. Bergelson has tended to be thought of as a writer who wrote his great novels before he became interested in returning to the Soviet Union, and that everything he wrote after that was not worth anybody's time because all he was doing was writing propaganda, right? So to your question about Azerbaijan, right? So yeah, he spent, they invited him in the 1930s to come out and visit. They offered him a flat. He decided to settle in Moscow instead, right? So that tells you something. But he wrote things that could be seen as sort of, praising, right, this sort of project of settling Jews in Siberia. And that describes it in various ways. Harriet Murav has written kind of compellingly about different ways in which weird things that seem to stand out in the text seem to counteract that overt propagandistic effort. So at some point, I forget which story it is, the protagonist climbs a mountain and they're blinded by the sun, so they can't see, right? What greatness there is to describe, right? I write a lot about this in the text that I write about this protagonists who do something similar, right? It's dark, or there's fog, right? There's something obscures what they're supposed to describe. So even when someone like Bergelson does, it's not clear, right? Or there's enough things to indicate in the text to what extent they believe it or not. So as to the reception, so I do write about the reception, some of the reception in the book. I haven't thought about, I mean, that's something I should maybe come back to, right, and think specifically about Ukraine-specific reception, right? I think about reception that happens in Yiddish, and the reception that happens in Yiddish is in multiple geographies, which is what makes Yiddish an interesting literature to work on, right? That's language that's not bound by any one geography, but at the time is very actively, thought about and read in and spoken in New York and in Warsaw and in Kiev and in Moscow and in Berlin, right? So the sort of various centers of Yiddish. So I think about Soviet reception from the time, and I don't know if I've thought about it as specifically Ukrainian, right? And the Soviet reception that I'm interested in is suspects that this novel, published though it may have been as something that sings praises of the Bolshevik state, the doctrinaire critics recognize that it's lacking in that, that it's doing something that a novel like this is not supposed to do. It's making the revolution less heroic. It's making the revolution, what is this, figure of the Bolshevik who is ill and dying, and like, what is that supposed to mean? So in some ways, kind of my interest in reception, I haven't thought about it as Ukrainian versus Yiddish, but written somewhere else, as opposed to Yiddish at the time in the Soviet Union versus reception by American Jewish literary scholars during the Cold War, who approach a text like this with a kind of neoconservative Cold War mindset, and they see in it only the propaganda because they don't know how to read Soviet texts. And they want to dismiss it as something that is not worth our time. This is the bad Bergelson that we shouldn't know how to read, and let's not translate it. And so, but that's a great question, and I'm curious to kind of think. It was not translated into Ukrainian as far as I know. It was translated into Russian, but not published. So when we worked on the translation, we did work with a typewritten, there weren't proofs, I guess, manuscript, corrected manuscript. There were corrections by hand of a Russian translation that exists in the archives. It was made in 1934, 1935, and the last page of the archival file is the rejection letter, right? That we're not going to publish this. So this is a few years after when this published in Yiddish, when maybe they realized that it's not really, a pro-Bolshevik text. So.
Further question, but just because we need to use the mic for the YouTube. To me, the Soviet or the Ukrainian reception is the Soviet reception, right? So Yiddish language newspapers in Soviet Ukraine were getting the same sort of political instructions that would appear in a Ukrainian language Soviet newspaper as well. So, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's some specific context in Yiddish newspapers, but I would be one, I guess, from my own positionality to caution against separating these things too greatly. Yeah, so that's my view, and I absolutely will go back and look at Harriet Moriav's book. Thank you.
It's great to kind of be able to think about resituating it. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I have a follow-up question based on something that you just said about the American reception, right? And seeing Bergelson as this sort of naive propagandist. This is not my area. I work on American Judaism, but when I think about, Americans in the 70s and the Soviet Jewry movement and how they think about Soviet Jews, and I was so I love that this is how you start the book and how you started this talk, right? There's this incredible infantilizing of Soviet Jews as people who have to be rescued, as people who are, like babies in a Jewish sense, right? Like there's the sort of the twinning of the bar and bat mitzvahs and the Haggadahs, right? Sort of sets up a very distinctive hierarchy of American Jews as the people who have the resources, the knowledge, there's the Jewish knowledge and the political knowledge, and of Soviet Jews as infants. And so I'm wondering, in the period in which you study, you sort of hinted in your response to Matt's question that infantilizing, that seeing these authors as people who are just naive propagandists, doesn't start with in the Stalinist era, right? But it actually goes back to the period that you study, and that there is an American misreading of these early Soviet Jews who are actually doing very, very deft work, moving between these genres of propaganda and critique if we know how to read them, as you know how to read them. And so that's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering about the contemporary American reception within the period in which you work, and whether we see seeds of that infantilizing of Soviet Jews as early as the period you're working in.
Thank you for the question. So I haven't thought about this period as reflected in contemporaneous American writing. That's your question, right? So aside from the texts that deal with America, so this chapter that deals with films that show returning from America, which get reviewed are shown in the United States, I guess my questions that I frame are very sort of Soviet-oriented. So now you kind of give me another idea. Matt gave me one idea, you give me another idea of sort of additional things to write about the same material. So kind of going back to Bergelson, he was, when he lives in Berlin all through the 20s, he maybe senses that this is not the place where he could remain. So there's a period when he tries to kind of think about whether New York might be a place to go. There is evidence that he was hoping that, I believe Yankov Gladstein would translate this Midas Hadin into English and publish it in America, right? So there was sort of interest in that relationship to America. So I don't think I know enough beyond that to really think about well, it's not true, right? So I can think about, now I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head, things that are not in the book, but, the chapter on Isaac Babel would yield interesting material potentially because Babel was translated into English for the first time in the 1920s, right? So it's interesting there is not really a critical apparatus in those translations that I know about, but there probably are reviews, right? So that would be sort of interesting what we know about Babel in English comes via Lionel Trilling in the 1950s, right? So that's the kind of Babel that Americans know, and there are many mistakes in Trilling's conceptualization of Babel because he doesn't understand that Babel isn't really writing autobiographies when he says that these are autobiographical stories, and there are all kinds of confusion. But I haven't thought about Babel in America before then, but I think there's probably enough text to do something like that. It hadn't occurred to me. If I may, I'll pivot to the sort of later period that, there is much more, and what you said, the kind of infantilization in a way. So I've written about that. So I came to, I took a break from writing this, and I wrote about more contemporary things, about contemporary immigrant writers, and I was interested in how people like David Bismozgis and people like Anew, people like Gary Steingart, Irina Rain, right? There's a lot of contemporary authors who were born in the Soviet Union. They're now in their 40s or 50s, who began writing in the last 20, 25 years. How in some ways, in their prose in English, they're responding, often satirically, to some of the stereotyping that they are sensitive to as creative writers that had gone on into a way that American Jews had imagined who they were before they arrived. And the thing I wrote about, I was kind of trying to think about this as a kind of colonization, right? Trying to think about how the Jews who need to be saved, right? And in many cases they do, right? So not to reject the advocacy, what was done on their behalf, but that advocacy also develops a particular kind of paternalistic relationship that then leads to misunderstandings and expectations, and you think you're saving these people who can't practice Judaism, and then they come to America and they bring, pork sandwiches to school, right, or whatever, right? So like it's sort of, they're not grateful for what we sort of hoped we would do, and there's a response, often satirical, to try to think through those things. And I think that what I try to, I don't think that this book is should be thought of that way alone, but it could be thought of as a kind of prequel, right? To try to actually go back to the beginning and to understand what a Soviet Jew might be, right? How it's also maybe typed in a certain way, but in a way that couldn't have been accessed during the Cold War, because the Cold War and the movement to save Soviet Jews was so refracted through different historical paradigms, right? The Holocaust had a lot to do with it. It was a kind of guilt of American Jewish community about not enough, or perception of that not enough was done to save them, right? So there's almost this like, we must save these people as a kind of second chance or something like that. That is, in many ways, a kind of collective, trauma that goes in multiple directions that hasn't been worked through. So, but you raise a great question about whether one could locate that in the 1930s, and I don't know, right? I think I have some idea, but also would need to understand the American Jewish 1920s and 1930s different. And I know some of it, including from some of your work, right? So, but the sort of different pressures on assimilation and whiteness and kind of what that meant for Jews in the United States at the time, yeah.
Hi. So I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm going to piggyback on it, but in a different way. Thank you so much for this. It was really, really interesting and thoughtful. And I actually am really, so I've been doing work on 1919, this period, 1919, 1921, and I'm so struck by how, so the stuff that I'm looking at is anti-Semitism, right? And it's not only anti-Semitism, but there's the figure of the Jew as modern at this time, right? The Jew is the epitome of modernity in a lot of ways. So it's so, and in fact, the Jew as Bolshevik, right? And the Jew as Soviet, right? As in anti-Semitic figuration, right? And so I guess the basic question that I have is like, how much are these people knowing that and dealing with it? And at least some of the documents that I've seen sort of suggest that some anti-Semitic, sort of people who have that, it was fed, it fed to them by sort of rumors and beliefs about the Jews, right, that are fed to them by Russians, by Ukrainians. So I'm sort of curious by how much that influences or shapes, or how much it's a conversation with that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great. So the kind of the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, right? So kind of that's the, and I'm sure you know the sort of texts. I don't need to call out the books, but the Paul Hannebrink and sort of other texts. But so I deal with this a little bit in the pogrom chapter because there is an association, and others have written about this too. Jeff Weidlinger, in his book on pogroms, sort of thinks about some of the anti-Semitic propaganda that equates the Jew and the Bolshevik, and how sometimes it's kind of hard to work through because they are very prominent Bolsheviks who are Jews, Trotsky most notably, who then becomes the poster child for anti-Semitic propaganda, right? So there's kind of loops in on itself. In this book, other people have written about the Soviet Jewish elites, right? And the kind of prominent people in the government or in the arts or kind of in the Soviet state hierarchy. I think in many ways, sort of Yuri Sloskin's The Jewish Century is sort of kind of thinking about a different kind of type that is really based on the sort of ethnic Jews who happen to be members of the Soviet elite, right? Where there's, I think, a closer intersection between kind of what you're asking, which then could, in a later period, also lead to some of the kind of anti-Semitism by various collaborators of Germans during the German occupation that then have sort of things to get back at the Jews for, because they were very prominent Jews who were Bolsheviks, right? So, like, that's not so much the literature that I'm working with, yeah. But what's the, yeah?
Sorry, yeah, no, I know I get that. I'm just curious whether there's a knowledge of it and whether
Oh,
there's
yeah.
conversations circulating, right? Like whether,
track
like,
of
I know
that.
that's there, but I'm curious how much they're
Right.
fighting with it, aware
Right.
of it, like how much there's a,
Right.
you know, engagement of it, basically.
Right. No, I mean, right. So definitely, you know, Isaac Babel works through this when he kind of in his Red Cavalry stories, and he's trying to kind of disentangle that myth or maybe re-entangle it, right, of somebody who is Jewish and is very involved with the Bolshevik regime. They're protagonists of some of the literature about the Chika that I mentioned, who are Jews, who are kind of very prominent in Soviet literature as ethnic Jews and exist in it as, you know, kind of very willing participants in the regime. So, and, you know, there's the Sekция, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, which, of course, is trying to kind of figure out how to Sovietize Jews in this very particular way. So I think that there's, of course, an understanding. I think I write about this a little bit only when it comes to the sort of stereotyping of Judeo-Bolshevism. But I need to think about the kind of transatlantic connection. Like, that is not something that I thought about. So, okay, one last question.
Hi, I just
Hello.
want to thank you so much. I learned a great deal from your talk. And you talked earlier about how certain families would go from the West, like to the United States, back to the Soviet Union, back and forth. And I kind of wanted to know how much of that played a part in the identity of the Soviet Union, like how they saw themselves because of that different environment from what the West was rather than the Soviet Union, if you know it all. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's a great question. So there were not that many people who did, but there were some who went, right? And there's some memoirs. There is a recent contemporary novel that tries to imagine a protagonist like this by Sana Krasikov. It's called The Patriots. It's a sort of long novel that tries to imagine, you know, a woman who is a young woman who is, you know, a child of immigrants and is in New York, and she, you know, is a socialist, and she goes to the Soviet Union. And so how would their identities be different? I mean, again, I approach this, or I know this through the sort of propaganda films, right? So it's hard to kind of answer that question with a straight face, right? Because I know that it's all kind of refracted through, you know, what the films have to show on the surface like this, right, is to show the eventual realization how much better, right, the Soviet Union is. So the guy that I'll keep coming back to the guy in question, right? So you know, he objects to the Soviet modes of laying bricks. It's all about laying bricks in this case, right? He says that he's, you know, spent decades of backbreaking labor building skyscrapers for Rockefeller, and he comes to the Soviet Union that is very concerned with the, you know, wellness of its workers, and, you know, there's this gymnastics and, you know, kind of the slaying of bricks. He says, no, I'm not going to do this. This is all, you know, silliness, and instead I'm going to break my back, you know, laying bricks, and then he loses, right? So the film has to show how he comes to see the light, right? And he does in the end, but then, of course, I sort of notice other things where that's not really clear. So, I mean, the Soviet Union is imagined as a paradise, right, as a utopian paradise. It's, you know, these characters are very useful. He's not the only one. There are also others who, for various reasons, find fault with America. Also, Palestine comes in a really interesting way. There's one film where the family resettles from Palestine around 1936 or so, that they have to articulate, you know, a disappointment on various other possibilities for Jews at the time, whether it be America or Zionism or something else, and then the Soviet Union becomes sort of the focal point for them. but, you know, these are films with a propagandistic intention, so it's hard to say. And then also historically, right, so the sort of really important to notice that those who move and those who stay, right, some of them end up, you know, in the gulag, right, and in a later period end up, you know, because they're from the West, right, become suspect, especially after the war, but also before the war. So in many cases, right, that story doesn't end well. And they're also interesting. I mean, I'm going on here for a long time. These movies are kind of, I mean, propaganda films are often smart, right, about what they understand to be the intervention that they could make, which is why it's very hard to dismiss them, right? So they're made during the Great Depression, right? So there is a reason why it's thought to be appealing, right? That, you know, somebody who has connections to a country that is now full on industrializing, right? Where, you know, often it also like attracts, the Soviet Union was very interested in foreign expertise, right? It was really interested in recruiting engineers from Germany or whatever, and then some of them were killed later in the 1930s, right? But there is a sort of interest that this is a place where you might go and build. Also, in this, again, I keep coming back to the slide. If you look closely at the slide, you'll see that there's a black man sitting behind. What is he doing there? And that's also really interesting because Nathan Becker doesn't travel alone. He comes back with his friend Jim, right? There's always going to be also another Soviet, refracted through Soviet stereotype, right? But they're understanding the attraction that some black Americans felt towards the Soviet Union because this is the 1930s Jim Crow America, right? So there's also the realization that the Soviet Union is seeming from the outside as this kind of paradise. And it's actually really interesting to see how this figure is always often proximate, right? So he's also a bricklayer, and he's also there, and he picks up a little Yiddish towards the end, right? So, but they're sort of trying to understand America as a site of many evils at the time, which is not incorrect. That's what's difficult about these sort of films, that it's hard to dismiss them merely as propaganda. So we have to kind of look, you have to both not engage it on its face value and also acknowledge that it emerges from a place that is reasonably attractive to different people for different reasons that are real, right? And so the numbers are they're never great numbers of Jews who move back to the Soviet Union, nor is the number of black Americans who move great, but they're significant, and they're left cultural imprints on that history between Langston Hughes and later Paul Robeson, and right, there's sort of very prominent names, and there are various sort of also prominent Jewish figures who do that kind of movement as well. So that's also really interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
People on your way out, there's still some books if you haven't picked one up. Just take one on your way out. And also a lot of the students here are here for classes that count for the Jewish Studies minor, so there's information on that, as well as student scholarships and study abroad opportunities. And please take some food out on your way out as well. So thank you.
And thank you all for coming. I mean, I'm happy to hang out if people want to chat. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to drop me an email. I don't know who is there, so it's like I'm staring at the